Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to Avian Home Adventures today. This is Colleen and Carol here, and today we're going to talk a little bit about feathers and show off some of our cool props that we have that we use during our programs. So all these props here, we always get the question, did we take these from live birds? And the answer of course is no. We do have birds that come into our hospital that don't always make it. And so we're able to use different parts to bring out to schools and educate everyone to get really up close to a lot of these things here. So we have a couple things here. We have a red-shouldered hawk wing that we have. There, of course, is that rusty red color on there. We have a great horned owl wing here, a little bit larger. We have a skull, a couple of talons, some tail feathers, and then a couple of really cool feathers that we'll talk about in a little bit. So feathers are really important to birds. So they serve a few different purposes. They help birds fly, of course, for a lot of our birds. Not all though. Help them attract a mate. Sometimes you'll see birds with really amazing coloring, peacocks and some other birds out there to attract a mate. They're also used for camouflage. If you notice, all these different tones of brown on top of each other kind of look like a little bit of like a bark, help them blend in with trees. They also help them stay warm and keep dry. So very important for our birds to have on their body, very important for them to be in good health and taken care of as well. So a really important thing is weatherproofing with these. So these birds have an oil gland actually at the base of their tail, which would be about here, and birds can squeeze out of the oil gland and preen that onto feathers. And by preen, I mean taking the oil with their beak and really just spreading it across. And so when they're doing that, they are putting this oil as a waterproof surface. So water will literally run off their back or run off their wings. So we like to think of it like a kind of like a windbreaker or like a rain jacket. So if you think of it that way, that's really important. So preening is a really a good thing that these birds do to really keep their feathers intact. They also, when they're preening, they can zip up these feathers together, so that way when they're flying, they're all locked in. So these feathers are made up of things called barbs and barbules, which you could not see on this camera. You probably need a microscope to get really in there. And in those barbs and barbules, they actually have hooks. They latch onto each other like Velcro. Or if you think about just zipping up your jacket, it does that same thing. And so when a bird's running their beak over it with that oil, or just setting their feathers up before they fly or after they're flying, they really can smooth those out and zip them in. So that's pretty cool, the system that they use to lock them down. So their tail feathers are used to really steer during flight. So if you notice, it can fan out here. They also can close in together. And it works a little bit like a rudder. So you think about a rudder on a ship, or you think of like an airplane with a tail. So that's really helping a lot with their steering.
Can you say what kind of wings these are again?
They're different. These are all different wings. So this is a red-shouldered hawk wing. So fun fact about this, they are called red-shouldered hawks because of this rusty red coloring and on their shoulders, but this actually isn't their shoulder. So starting up here is their wrist. If you think about it from your wrist and your hand going out, that's really what is going on here, out here. So this would be more of like the fingertips. We also have a great horned owl wing. You'll notice it's a little bit larger. It's really, really fluffy. We'll talk about why owls have a different kind of wing or feathers than some of our other birds. We have a juvenile red-tailed hawk tail. So this is before they get that rusty red coloring. They have this like striped pattern, and after a few years, I think it's around like 3 years or so, that they'll get that red coloring in. And that's what they're really most known for. We also have we have an owl skull, an owl talon, and we have a red-tailed hawk talon and some other feathers laying around. So there are different kinds of feathers. There are downy feathers, which are these loose feathers that are against birds' bodies. So if Carol will pan up to our little demonstration over here. So they would be all in this kind of body area, and underneath a lot of these feathers, they're this little fluffy loose structure that you see. And so what that does is it traps air against their body, and birds can warm that up. They also have the ability to release that air if they need to, but it works a little bit like a fleece jacket. So you have your weatherproofing, the really slick feathers on top, and then you have this downy, more like insulator feathers underneath. So they also have contour feathers, which are what you see covering most of the bird's body, and really make a streamlined shape. So more on like the base of the body is where you would see all of those. There's also contour feathers on the wings, but on the wings they're called something called coverts. And so these are really important because they help streamline the wing. So when they're flying, they're more efficient. So they attach from this bone here, and they basically cover up some of these other feathers. We have primaries and we have secondaries here. And they're really overlapping to smooth it out so there's not like a disruption of air when they're trying to fly.
Kate would like to know, how do birds stay waterproof?
How do they stay waterproof? So they have this oil gland at the base of their tail that they can squeeze out with their beak, and they can spread it all over their feathers. And so by taking it, just spreading it over their tail, over their whole body, it's really cool. So that oil just repels water, and it will roll literally off of their back when it is raining. So we have primary feathers too. These are the longest, sorry Carol, I'm like turning this wrong way. These are the longest flight feathers that they have here. They're kind of this like leading edge going over here. And then we have our secondary feathers. So what's cool about these primaries is they actually can be controlled and rotated. They are stiff, but they can really navigate with those. So thinking of them a little bit like fingers on some birds. And they actually can even spread out forward. This is a little stiff, but thinking like fingertips again when they're flying. And then the secondaries here are providing most of the lift for when birds are flying, which is important to get up in the air for sure. So there's some differences between these two wings here. So of course we have a hawk, we have a daytime hunter, we have an owl, we have a nighttime hunter, also known as being nocturnal. So with our hawks, or falcons, or eagles, these birds are really relying on their speed to catch their food. So they're really, really fast, and they're able to catch food without a problem. With our owls, they're a little bit slower. They're hunting at night, and so they have specialized feathers that are a little bit like shag carpet. They're really fluffy and dense, and they have a leading edge of feathers as well. And so what that does is actually silences their flight, so they can sneak up on prey, which is really cool. You might be able to see it better if you guys can see that little fringing. It's like a little comb. And those feathers continue all the way down to owl's feet. Might be better on the paper, but you guys can see all these little feathers down to the little toes. And then compared to a hawk, which the feathers kind of stop here. And so that also insulates owls, and it muffles the sound when they're flying. Might be able to make a little bit of noise with these. I don't know if you guys could hear that, but that was a hawk wing, and then this one is an owl wing. So our owls are like the ninjas of the night, which is really, really neat.
Do all raptors have the oil gland on their tail?
Yes, they do. They do. It's something that gets checked on. Their feather condition and their oil gland, along with the rest of their physical exams for their wellness checks, always get checked out.
Hadley would like to know if boys and girls have the same or different color feathers.
So that depends. That's a great question. So depending on the species, some of them show what we call dimorphism, which means the males and the females show different coloration. Some do not. So a really great example of that are our American kestrels. The males have this steel blue color on them, while the females have more of a brown color. And when you see that, it's a really great way to ID them instantly, to know what their sex is. Another thing we do for our birds, if we don't have that luxury of being able to tell, is we can do a blood test and send off their DNA to get some information as to what sex they are.
And we have a 4-year-old who would like to know if birds eat small doggies. They have a Chihuahua.
I would say that would be very unlikely that they would. So raptors can pick up and carry off something that weighs about less than I think it's a third of their body weight actually. So most of our raptors here, the largest, weigh about 3 and 4 pounds. So they're picking up something that's maybe a pound, and sometimes our dogs, or our cats do fall under that smaller weight, but they're usually not going to go for them. They're going to go for more like rats and squirrels and things. The safest thing to do is to just always be outside with your animals, and typically that will deter any raptor from wanting to come up to you. Typically the only reason that they do come after smaller, companion animals like that is because there's a nest nearby, or they might be a little bit territorial if it's a nesting season.
Do all raptors molt their feathers?
They do. So they molt their feathers, or basically replace their feathers every year. It really changes, or it depends on the amount or the size of the feathers, or really how many they'll do. So some birds will molt a ton of these little smaller feathers and then have them come back in. Other birds might shed a couple of primaries. Typically when they get rid of those feathers, they're symmetrical. So if one bird loses this primary on this wing, they'll typically lose that same primary on the other wing to really keep them balanced when they're flying. So the reason that they do need to molt is because if you think about flying around, hunting your food, maybe hitting some branches, those feathers really get worn down and torn up quite a bit. So that just replaces those feathers with brand new shiny feathers to make them more efficient with flying and hunting, whatever they're doing.
And you said that's an owl skull?
Yes, this is an owl skull. So owls, which unfortunately we don't have a demonstration here, but they have small bristles around their face that work a little bit like whiskers. So they look very hair-like and even like eyelashes, but they're actually just modified feathers, which is super cool. This is a barred owl skull, and the reason we know that this is an owl skull is it has this ring here called a sclerotic ring, and that's holding their eyes into place. So unlike us, where we have muscle that holds our eyeballs into our head, these guys, their eyes are so heavy that they actually need a bone to keep them in place. I'm sure a lot of you guys have heard of owls being able to turn their head 360 degrees all the way around. Unfortunately, that would be really cool, but it is not true. They can rotate their head about 270 degrees, and the reason they need to do that is because their eyes are set in place. So they don't have a peripheral vision back here like we do. So they need to be able to turn their head to really see what's going on.
And you said all of this stuff came from where?
All of this stuff came in from patients in our hospital who unfortunately didn't make it. We do have a really great success rate for our hospital. I believe it's like 60% or so after the first 28 or 48 hours. I don't remember exactly that statistic. But so we have a really great medical team, but unfortunately we can't save everybody. But what we can do is use these to really help talk about birds that typically you don't get to see up very close in your backyard, or some of you might, but probably not this close to where you can see all these feathers. And so when we do school programs or just public events, we like to bring a lot of these little props out so you guys can touch them, see them, look at them. They're really, really cool.
How many primary or secondary feathers can a bird lose and still be able to fly?
That's a good question. I don't know if I have a good answer for that. I would say for the most part, our birds don't lose a ton of those at a time. And when they do lose that feather, there is a feather right underneath it ready to come out. So when feathers are coming in, they actually have a vein. This will actually be better. There's actually a vein that comes in with the feather. It's a blood supply. And then as it's growing fully in, that blood supply will recede and it becomes this like hollow shaft, which makes it very aerodynamic too. It's very light, as you might be able to kind of hear with that, but it's very light and very hollow. Typically they're only going to lose a couple to a few larger feathers because it takes a lot of energy to create new feathers. And so, that would really be exhausting on their body to have to molt a ton. There are certain birds that do something called catastrophic molting, which if you pay attention to our Facebook feed, we'll likely post one of our screech owls whenever it happens. But they'll actually lose their entire head feather set, and it is hilarious. They look like little crazy Muppets, which is awesome. And we actually have a duck here she does a catastrophic molt on all of her feathers, which is very unique.
Can you tell how old a raptor is by just looking at its feathers?
I personally could not. I would say if there's certain coloration, yes. So for instance, if we did look at this, we would know that this was a juvenile red tail because it doesn't have the rusty red tail that it's known for. It doesn't get that until after a few years typically, so maybe like three-ish years that it would get it. So if this bird came in with this kind of tail, we'd know maybe it's under a couple of years. Some birds, or all birds, have more of like a juvenile plumage, which is different from their adult feathers. So if they have that, we can typically, they'll keep that until their first molt, and we'll know that, oh, they're a first year bird, they're a hatching year bird, and so we can identify them there. All right, guys, thank you so much for tuning in to our avian home adventures. We thank you so much for your support, and we'll see you tomorrow at 11.